Growing up in the Sacred Light compound in rural Montana, I thought the outside world was exactly what Elder Marcus told us, a cesspool of sin and corruption where women were used and discarded like trash. At least here, he said, we were protected and cherished as God's vessels. The compound housed about 200 people across 15 families, all following the teachings of Prophet Ezekiel, a man who claimed direct communication with God. Women wore long dresses and covered their hair. Men made all decisions. Children were homeschooled to keep them pure from worldly influence. I was born here to parents who joined when my mother Rachel was pregnant with me. My father David worked construction for the church, sending his entire paycheck to the community fund. We lived in a small cabin with my 4 younger siblings, sharing 2 bedrooms and an outhouse. When I turned 12, everything changed. That's when Prophet Ezekiel announced God had revealed my future husband, Brother Samuel, a 34-year-old widower whose first wife had died in childbirth at 19. I should have been honored, my mother said, tears of joy streaming down her face. Samuel was respected, prosperous, and had specifically requested me after years of prayer. The engagement ceremony was beautiful, they all said. I stood in a white dress while Prophet Ezekiel bound our hands with rope, explaining that God had predetermined this union before I was born. Samuel placed a purity ring on my finger, promising to wait until my 16th birthday when I'd be ready for marriage and childbearing. 4 years to prepare seemed like forever, but it wasn't. Those years were filled with wife training under the guidance of the church mothers. I learned to cook elaborate meals, preserve food, sew clothing, and manage a household. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I cleaned Samuel's house while he was at work, learning his preferences and routines. Sister Margaret, the head wife trainer, had specific lessons about wifely duties. She taught us about submission, about how our bodies belong to our husbands, about the blessing of bearing many children quickly. The more children, the greater our reward in heaven. A wife's greatest joy is serving her husband and raising his children, she'd repeat weekly. Your opinions, your desires, your dreams, these are selfish thoughts that lead to unhappiness. Find joy in service. But something felt wrong. I couldn't name it at first, just a growing unease that I pushed down because questioning was sinful. The feeling grew stronger when I turned 14 and began helping with the younger children during church services. That's when I noticed how many women looked exhausted, how many carried babies while pregnant again, how many seemed afraid of their husbands. Sister Mary, only 23, already had 5 children and moved carefully like her body ached. Sister Ruth flinched whenever her husband raised his voice during sermons. The worst was when Samuel's neighbor, Brother John, married 13-year-old Grace. I watched her on her wedding day, pale and trembling as she promised to obey and serve. 3 months later, she was pregnant. 6 months after that, she lost the baby and nearly died from complications. God's will, Prophet Ezekiel announced. Sister Grace must pray harder for worthiness. That night, I asked my mother about the outside world, about what regular people did, about whether women there had children so young. She looked terrified. Don't ask such questions, Hannah. The outside world is full of temptation and evil. Women there are used by multiple men, discarded when they age, forced to work instead of fulfilling their divine purpose. Would you rather be treasured by one godly man or used by many sinful ones? But doubt had taken root. I began paying attention differently, noticing things I'd been trained to ignore. How Prophet Ezekiel had 7 wives, the youngest just 15. How women who questioned teachings disappeared for spiritual counseling and returned subdued and fearful. How the older teenage boys left for missions, but the girls never did. When I turned 15, my wedding preparations intensified. Sister Margaret taught me about the marriage bed, explaining my duty to submit joyfully to whatever my husband required. She described the process of consummation in clinical terms that made my stomach churn. Pain is temporary, she said, but the joy of serving your husband and bearing his children is eternal. Samuel began visiting more frequently, bringing gifts and reminders of our approaching wedding. He'd sit too close during these chaperone visits, his hand lingering on mine while he described our future. 8 children, he hoped. A son first, then daughters to help manage the household. You're going to make me very happy, Hannah. he'd say, his eyes making me feel exposed despite my modest dress. The turning point came 6 months before my 16th birthday. I was cleaning Samuel's house when I found something that changed everything. A small radio hidden in his workshop, tuned to a news station. I'd never heard outside news before. The voices described a world completely different from what we'd been taught. Women were doctors, lawyers, business owners. They chose when to marry, whether to have children, how to live their lives. There were laws protecting children from marriage, organizations helping people escape religious cults. Religious cults. The phrase hit me like lightning. That's what we were. I listened for 20 minutes before fear made me turn it off, but the damage was done. Everything I'd been taught was a lie designed to keep us trapped. Over the next month, I managed to listen several more times, learning about the outside world, about women's rights, about organizations that helped people escape controlling religious groups. I learned there were laws against marrying children, that what was happening to Grace and the other young wives was called abuse. I also learned about something called the internet, where people could find information about anything. Samuel's house had a computer for his construction business, but it was password protected. However, I discovered he'd written the password on a paper hidden in his desk drawer. Late one night, while supposedly cleaning, I accessed the internet for the first time. The flood of information was overwhelming. I found websites about cult recovery, stories from other women who'd escaped similar situations, legal resources for minors trapped in forced marriages. I also found something that made my blood run cold, news articles about our compound. 3 years earlier, a former member named Jessica Thompson had escaped and gone to authorities, claiming children were being abused and forced into marriage. The investigation had been dropped when no one would cooperate, and Jessica couldn't provide enough evidence. But in the comments section of one article, I found a message. If anyone is still trapped in sacred light, I'm here to help. There is a way out, JT, with an email address. My hands shook as I created a secret email account and sent a message. I'm 15, being forced to marry a 34-year-old in 6 months. How do I get out? The response came within hours. I've been waiting for someone to contact me. Yes, there's a way out, but it requires careful planning. Are you ready to risk everything for freedom? Jessica became my lifeline over the next few months. Through carefully deleted email exchanges, she taught me about the outside world, about my legal rights, about organizations that could help. She explained that at 15, I could petition for emancipation if I could prove I was in danger. More importantly, she told me I wasn't alone. Since her escape, 12 other people had left the compound, though most had been adults who could leave legally. Only 2 had been minors, and both had needed extensive legal help to avoid being returned to their families. Jessica gave me a crash course in survival, how to obtain identification documents, how to access social services, how to apply for emancipation, which law enforcement agencies would take my claims seriously. She even had contacts who could help with safe housing and education. But the most important thing she taught me was how to document everything. Without evidence, they'll just claim you're a confused child influenced by outside forces, she explained. You need proof of the forced marriage, the isolation, the abuse. Using Samuel's computer, I began taking screenshots of internal church documents I found on Prophet Ezekiel's shared drive. Financial records showing member donations, schedules for spiritual counseling sessions, and most damning, a spreadsheet tracking young girls and their assigned future husbands, some as young as 11. I also started recording conversations with my phone, which I'd hidden from my parents. The recordings captured church leaders discussing marriages, discipline, and their plans to keep children isolated from outside influence. 3 months before my wedding, I had enough evidence to move forward with Jessica's plan. She'd connected me with a lawyer named Patricia Wu, who specialized in helping children escape religious cults. Patricia would file for emergency protective custody the day I ran, using the evidence I'd gathered. But first, I had to get out of the compound. The compound was surrounded by an 8-foot fence, ostensibly to keep outsiders away, but really to keep us in. There were only 2 gates, the main entrance, which was guarded 24/7, and a service entrance used for supply deliveries. Both had security cameras. Jessica and I spent weeks planning my escape route. The compound's back fence bordered national forest land. If I could get through the fence at night, I could hike 2 miles through the woods to a Forest Service road where Jessica would be waiting. The challenge was getting from my family's cabin to the back fence without being seen. The compound had night patrols, and my absence would be noticed quickly since I shared a room with my 2 younger sisters. My opportunity came during the Harvest Festival, when everyone would be at the main hall until late. I told my parents I felt sick and needed to rest, then slipped out through my bedroom window once the celebrations were underway. I'd hidden a backpack with supplies behind our cabin, warm clothes, the evidence I'd printed, Jessica's contact information, and $200 I'd secretly saved from odd jobs around the compound. Getting to the back fence meant crossing several open areas where I could be spotted, but the harvest celebration provided enough noise to cover my movement. The fence was topped with barbed wire, but I'd prepared for this. Using wire cutters I'd stolen from the maintenance shed, I carefully cut through the chain link at ground level, creating a gap just large enough to crawl through. The barbed wire caught my jacket and scraped my back as I squeezed through, but I was free. For the first time in my life, I was outside the compound boundaries without permission. The hike through the forest was terrifying. I'd never been alone in the woods at night, and every sound made me think I was being pursued. My phone's GPS guided me toward the meeting point, but the battery was dying and I had no way to charge it. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, I reached the Forest Service road. Jessica's car was there, headlights off, engine running. She was a small woman in her late 20s with short hair and kind eyes, the first person from the outside world I'd ever met. "Are you Hannah?" she asked softly. I nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by what I'd done. I was really leaving everything I'd ever known. "You're incredibly brave," she said, helping me into the car. "Now let's get you somewhere safe." The drive to town took an hour, during which Jessica explained what would happen next. We'd go to the police station where I'd file a report about the forced marriage and provide my evidence. Child Protective Services would be called, and I'd be placed in emergency foster care while the court decided on my emancipation petition. "Your parents will be notified," she warned. "They'll probably claim you've been kidnapped or influenced by anti-religious forces. Are you prepared for that?" I was as prepared as anyone could be for declaring war on their entire world. The police station was intimidating, but Officer Maria Santos treated me with kindness and respect. She listened carefully as I explained the situation, looking increasingly disturbed as I described the forced marriages and isolation tactics used by the compound. "How old did you say your intended husband is?" she asked. 34. We're supposed to marry next month when I turn 16. "And you've been engaged since you were 12? "Yes, ma'am." Officer Santos exchanged glances with her partner. "Honey, this is called child abuse. What's happening to you is illegal, engagement or no engagement." By morning, everything was in motion. CPS had assigned me a caseworker named David Chen, who explained that I'd be placed with an emergency foster family while the investigation proceeded. Patricia Wu arrived to begin the legal process of seeking emancipation. The compound's response was swift and predictable. By noon, Prophet Ezekiel and my parents had arrived at the police station with their own lawyer, claiming I'd been kidnapped and brainwashed by anti-religious extremists. "Hannah is a confused child who's been influenced by people who hate our faith," Prophet Ezekiel declared to the assembled media he'd somehow summoned. "We're a peaceful religious community being persecuted for our beliefs." My mother looked directly into the news cameras, tears streaming down her face. "Please bring my daughter home. She's been deceived by people who want to destroy our family." But I had evidence they couldn't explain away. The spreadsheet tracking underage girls and their assigned husbands, the recordings of church leaders discussing forced marriages, documentation of the compound's isolation tactics. Patricia presented it all to the judge at my emergency hearing. "This is a clear case of a minor being prepared for forced marriage," Judge Reynolds declared. "The protective custody order will remain in place pending full investigation." My parents' lawyer argued that religious freedom protected their right to arrange marriages according to their beliefs, but Judge Reynolds wasn't having it. Religious freedom doesn't override state laws protecting children from abuse, she stated firmly. This court recognizes no religious exemption for child marriage. The foster family CPS found for me was incredible. Mike and Susan Rodriguez were in their 50s with grown children, and they'd fostered dozens of kids over the years, including several who'd escaped religious cults. "We understand this is scary," Susan said as she showed me to my own bedroom, the first time I'd ever had private space. "You're safe here, and you're in control of what happens next." The adjustment was overwhelming. Simple things like choosing my own clothes, watching television, or eating meals at times I selected felt revolutionary. I'd never made decisions for myself, never been asked my opinion about anything important. Susan enrolled me in public high school, which was terrifying and wonderful simultaneously. I was behind academically. The compound's homeschooling had focused on religious studies and basic skills rather than college preparation. But I was eager to learn. My classmates were curious about my background, but respectful when I said I'd been homeschooled in a religious community. Only a few teachers knew the full story, and they provided extra support to help me catch up. The legal battle continued for months. My parents filed motion after motion trying to regain custody, each one painting me as a confused child, manipulated by anti-religious forces. Prophet Ezekiel gave interviews claiming the compound was being persecuted by people who hated their traditional values. But their narratives fell apart when other former members came forward. Jessica's original testimony had given investigators enough to reopen their investigation, and this time, they found witnesses willing to talk. Sarah Kim, who'd escaped 2 years earlier but hadn't reported anything due to fear, testified about the young marriages and isolation tactics. Mark Stevens, a former compound member, provided details about the financial control and emotional manipulation used to keep families trapped. Most damaging was testimony from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a pediatrician who'd briefly provided medical care to compound members. She described treating multiple teenage girls for pregnancy complications and being prevented from reporting suspected abuse because the families would simply stop bringing children for medical care. "I saw patterns consistent with systematic child abuse," Dr. Walsh testified. Young girls bearing children before their bodies were ready, living in fear, showing signs of severe emotional trauma. The compound's lawyers argued that everything was consensual religious practice protected by the First Amendment, but the evidence was overwhelming. Spreadsheets don't lie, and recordings of leaders planning underage marriages speak for themselves. Judge Reynolds granted my emancipation petition 6 months after my escape. At 16, I was legally an adult, free to make my own decisions about where to live, go to school, and how to live my life. "You've shown remarkable courage and maturity," she told me at the final hearing. "You should be proud of what you've accomplished." My parents attended every hearing, always hoping I'd change my mind and come home. My mother would try to catch my eye, mouthing, "I love you," and gesturing for me to approach her. My father looked older, defeated, like he couldn't understand how his obedient daughter had become this rebellious stranger. During one recess, my mother managed to get close enough to speak to me. "Hannah, please," she whispered urgently. "You're destroying our family. Samuel still wants to marry you. It's not too late to fix this." "Mom, I was 12 when you promised me to a 34-year-old man," I replied. "That's not love. That's not protection. That's abuse." She recoiled like I'd slapped her. "Don't use those worldly words. You've been poisoned against your own family." "I've been educated about my rights." "What's that?" I corrected. "There's a difference." The compound faced serious legal consequences beyond my case. Federal and state authorities launched comprehensive investigations into financial fraud, child abuse, and immigration violations. Several leaders, including Prophet Ezekiel, were arrested and charged with various crimes. Samuel himself was charged with attempted statutory rape based on evidence of his intentions to marry and impregnate me before my 18th birthday. He ultimately pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for testimony against Prophet Ezekiel. The compound tried to weather the storm, but membership began declining as families left. Some moved to other similar communities, but others, like Sarah Kim and Mark Stevens, integrated into mainstream society. Jessica started a nonprofit organization called Freedom Path, dedicated to helping people escape religious cults and transition to independent life. She asked me to speak at events, sharing my story to help others recognize the signs of spiritual abuse. Speaking publicly was terrifying at first, but I found strength in knowing my words might help someone else escape. Each person who heard my story and recognized their own situation was a victory against the system that had tried to control me. The personal cost was enormous. My parents and siblings completely cut contact, treating me as dead according to compound teachings. Holiday cards I sent were returned unopened. Attempts to reach out through social media were blocked. My youngest sister, Emma, who was only 8 when I left, had no way to contact me independently. Sometimes I wondered if she even remembered me, or if they'd told her I died or never existed. The hardest part was accepting that my family had chosen the compound over me. They'd rather lose their daughter than question the system that had shaped their entire worldview. College was my salvation. With help from victim advocacy organizations, I received scholarships and support services that made higher education possible. I studied social work, determined to help other kids in situations like mine. During my sophomore year, I received an unexpected email from my cousin Rebecca, who was 2 years younger and had been like a sister to me before I left. "Hannah, I don't know if you'll get this, but I had to try. I'm getting married next month to Brother Thomas. I'm scared. Is there really a way out like you found? Please help me." My heart broke and soared simultaneously. Rebecca had somehow accessed the internet and found me, but she was about to be forced into the same trap I'd escaped. Jessica and I worked frantically to help her. By now, Freedom Path had established protocols for these situations: safe houses, legal contacts, educational resources. But Rebecca was still a minor living in the compound, making escape much more difficult. We planned carefully over several weeks of secret communication. Rebecca would claim to be sick during a supply run to town, then slip away from her chaperones to meet Jessica at a predetermined location. The plan worked perfectly. Rebecca made it to the meeting point and was placed in protective custody within hours. CPS, now experienced with compound cases thanks to my situation, moved quickly to ensure her safety. Her escape prompted another exodus from the compound. 3 more families left within the month, tired of the restrictions and afraid of losing more children to the outside world. But it also prompted a harsh crackdown. Prophet Ezekiel, out on bail pending trial, imposed new restrictions on internet access and outside contact. Families were forbidden from traveling to town without escorts. Children were watched more closely than ever. My parents, devastated by losing a second daughter, became even more isolated and defensive. They gave interviews to religious media outlets, claiming the government was persecuting them for their faith and that their daughters had been kidnapped by anti-Christian forces. Watching those interviews was painful. My mother looked aged beyond her years, her faith the only thing keeping her functional. My father seemed broken, unable to understand how his carefully controlled world had unraveled. But I couldn't let guilt override the truth. They had chosen to participate in a system that abused children. They had known what was happening to young girls in the compound and had actively participated in perpetuating it. 3 years after my escape, Prophet Ezekiel was convicted on multiple federal charges, including conspiracy to commit child abuse, financial fraud, and immigration violations. He received a 20-year prison sentence. Several other compound leaders received shorter sentences, while some members like my parents faced civil penalties but avoided criminal charges by cooperating with investigators. The compound itself was disbanded, its property sold to pay restitution to victims. Most families scattered to other communities or integrated into mainstream society. A few hardcore believers followed one of Prophet Ezekiel's lieutenants to a new compound in Idaho. By then, I was thriving in college, working part-time for Freedom Path, and in a healthy relationship with a classmate named Jake, who understood my background and supported my advocacy work. Jake was everything Samuel wasn't: Respectful, supportive, genuinely interested in my thoughts and dreams. He never pressured me physically or emotionally, instead encouraging me to set boundaries and express my needs. "You're the strongest person I know," he'd tell me when I shared stories about the compound. "What you've accomplished is incredible." Our relationship developed slowly, at my pace, with my consent at every step. The contrast with what had been planned for me was stark. This was what healthy love looked like. During my senior year of college, I received another unexpected contact. This time, it was my brother Matthew, who was now 19 and had managed to leave the compound when it disbanded. "Hannah, I know you probably hate us all, but I wanted you to know I'm sorry," his email began. "I believed what they taught us about you being deceived and evil. But living in the real world now, I understand what you did. You saved yourself and probably saved Rebecca and others too." We met for coffee near my campus, both nervous about seeing each other after 5 years. Matthew looked older, more serious, but he had the same kind eyes I remembered from childhood. "Mom and Dad still talk about you sometimes," he said quietly. "They pray for your soul and hope you'll come back to the truth someday. But I think they know that's never going to happen." "How are Emma and the others?" I asked, hungry for news about my siblings. "Emma's 16 now. She asks about you sometimes, but Mom shuts down those conversations quickly. David and Sarah are just trying to adapt to normal life. It's hard when everything you believed turns out to be lies." Matthew was struggling with his own transition, working dead-end jobs while trying to get his GED and figure out how to function in the world. I connected him with services that helped cult survivors, and he slowly began building an independent life. Through Matthew, I learned that several compound families had experienced similar splits. Children who reached adulthood often left, while parents and younger siblings either moved to other religious communities or struggled to adapt to mainstream society. After college, I was hired by a statewide organization that investigated child abuse in religious communities. My personal experience made me uniquely qualified to identify warning signs and connect with potential victims. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply rewarding. Each child we helped escape was a victory against systems that viewed children as property rather than individuals with rights. I also continued speaking publicly about my experience, traveling to conferences and universities to educate people about religious abuse and cult recovery. The responses were always powerful. Audience members who recognized their own experiences, professionals learning to identify warning signs, supporters wanting to help. One presentation at a social work conference led to an unexpected reunion. A woman approached me afterward, tears in her eyes. "Hannah, it's Grace, from the compound." Grace looked completely different, healthy, confident, wearing modern clothes and makeup, but I recognized her eyes, no longer filled with the fear I remembered. "Grace, how did you get out?" "After you escaped and the investigation started, my husband Thomas was arrested for assault. While he was in jail, I got help from the same lawyer who helped you. I've been free for 3 years now." We spent hours catching up. Grace had finished her GED, was working as a medical assistant, and had custody of her daughter, the child she'd been pregnant with when I knew her in the compound. "You started it all," she told me. "If you hadn't been brave enough to leave first, none of us would have known it was possible." That conversation reminded me why the struggle had been worth it. Change often starts with one person willing to say no, to risk everything for the possibility of something better. Now, 5 years after my escape, I'm 21 years old and living a life I couldn't have imagined as a child. I'm engaged to Jake, planning a wedding where I'll choose my dress, my vows, and my future. I have a career helping other people find freedom. I'm pursuing a master's degree in social work. But yesterday I received an email that brought everything flooding back. "Hannah, this is your mother. I hope this message reaches you. I'm very sick. The doctors say I don't have long. I know we've had our differences, but you're still my daughter and I love you. The family has decided to forgive you for the mistakes you made. If you come home, we can put all this behind us and be a family again. Prophet Jeremiah, who replaced Prophet Ezekiel, has agreed to perform a cleansing ceremony to remove the worldly influences from your spirit. Samuel is married to someone else now, but there are other good men who would be honored to have you as a wife. Please come home before it's too late. We're all praying for your return, Mom." I stared at that email for a long time, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Sadness for my mother's illness, anger at their continued refusal to acknowledge the truth, and pity for people so trapped in their beliefs that they couldn't see the abuse they'd participated in. The phrase, "forgive you for the mistakes you made," particularly stung. In their worldview, my mistake was refusing to be sexually abused as a child bride. My mistake was exposing their crimes and helping other children escape. Jake found me crying at my laptop and held me while I explained the email. "Are you going to respond?" he asked gently. "I don't know. Part of me wants to see her before she dies. She's still my mother, despite everything. But part of me knows that going back would validate their belief that I was wrong, that I should have stayed and accepted what they planned for me." "What does your heart tell you?" "That I'm not the one who needs forgiveness." I showed the email to Jessica, who'd become a mentor and friend over the years. Her response was characteristically direct. "They haven't changed," she pointed out. "They're still trying to manipulate you with guilt and false promises. If your mother wanted a real relationship with you, she would acknowledge what was done to you and apologize for her role in it." She was right. The email contained no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no apology for years of grooming me for abuse, no recognition that I had saved myself from a terrible fate. Instead, it framed my escape as selfish rebellion that could be forgiven if I submitted again. I drafted several responses over the next few days. Angry letters detailing everything they'd done wrong, sad messages about wishing things could be different, explanations of why I couldn't return. Finally, I settled on something simple. "Mom, I'm sorry you're sick. I hope you find peace, but I won't apologize for saving myself from abuse, and I won't return to a community that views children as property. I've built a good life helping other people escape situations like the one you prepared me for. If you want to have a relationship with me, it needs to be based on accepting who I am now, not trying to change me back into the frightened child I was. I love you, but I won't sacrifice my freedom or safety for that love. Hannah." I never received a response to that email. 2 months later, Matthew contacted me to say our mother had passed away. The funeral was held at their new compound in Idaho, and I wasn't welcome to attend. It was a painful reminder that choosing freedom sometimes means accepting permanent loss. My family had made their choice. The compound's teachings mattered more to them than their relationships with their daughters. But I'd made my choice too. I chose to value my own life, my own future, my own right to make decisions about my body and my destiny. I chose to help other children escape the same fate. The work continues. Last month, Freedom Path helped a 14-year-old girl escape from a polygamous community in Utah. Next week, I'm testifying before a state legislative committee about strengthening laws against child marriage. Every success reminds me that the choice I made at 15 to risk everything for freedom was the right one. I may have lost my original family, but I found something even more valuable. A life of my own choosing, relationships based on respect rather than control, and the knowledge that I'm helping prevent other children from suffering as I did. Sometimes people ask if I have any regrets about exposing the compound and destroying my family's way of life. The answer is always no. I regret that children were being abused. I regret that families were torn apart by lies and manipulation. I regret that my parents chose their beliefs over their daughters. But I don't regret refusing to be a victim. I don't regret fighting for my freedom, and I don't regret helping other people find theirs. The compound may be gone, but the work isn't finished. As long as children are being married off against their will, as long as religious freedom is used to justify abuse, as long as young people are trapped in systems that view them as property rather than people, there's still work to do. I'm grateful every day for the courage that 15-year-old girl found to cut through a fence and walk into an uncertain future. She didn't know what was waiting for her, but she knew it had to be better than what she was leaving behind. She was right.